Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, future generations. I'm your host, Dr. Pavini Moray, and today it's such a deep pleasure to welcome Jezmina Von Thiele. And she is a Romani and Sinti writer, academic, activist, and educator. She's also a dancer, an art model, a healer, and a witch of mixed heritages. She practices her Sinti family trades, including healing, which includes herbalism, bodywork, card, palm, or tea leaf reading. She is a Romani, a belly dancer, and a fine arts model. She's also a writer and academic, and she publishes under the name Jessica Reedy, and she writes poetry, fiction, and nonfiction, and she's won tons of prizes and been in lots of publications. She's queer, and she lives in Brooklyn, and you can find out more about Jezmina and her work on Instagram, which is at Jezmina Von Thiele. I'm going to spell it out for you. Jezmina.VonThiele. Jezmina, welcome. So good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted.
Yeah. Well, I would love it if you would just start by saying a little prayer.
This is more of a little tiny blessing that I'm very fond of in the Romani language, which I'm not fluent in, but I'm learning with the help of sweet friends. My grandmother lost the language when she grew up hiding her ethnicity in Nazi Germany, which is pretty common of Sinti and other Roma in Western Europe and a little in Eastern Europe too, around the war. But the phrase is lacho dram, which means safe travel or a safe road. And I love this little blessing because the idea is that we are all on a journey. It might be a literal journey. If you grew up itinerant or traveling for work and for survival in the Romani culture, but it can also just mean blessings on your life journey. And so I'd like to extend that to everyone. Lacho dram.
Well received. Thank you for that. Talk to me about your ancestors. Tell me a little bit about the way you know them, both the ones who maybe you knew when they were alive or those who you have only known on the other side. Yeah, just curious about that relationship and how you practice.
I am really lucky to still have both my grandmothers with me. I have a sweet little Italian nonna in her 90s and my Sinti grandma in her 80s. And I'm very close with both of them. And especially my grandmother, who's Sinti, really raised me with as many traditions as she possibly could. It was difficult for her to connect with her heritage in the way that she wanted to, growing up in the Nazi era and trying to avoid the camps. And her mother was very, very smart and cleverly married a very rural, unfortunately, extremely abusive farmer. I still don't know how exactly, but secured some false papers. She got people to vouch for her. And just really laid low with her children way, way up by the North Sea. there were some close calls. Nazi officers would come to the house and question them and look through their paperwork pretty regularly. So it was really extra important that the children didn't know how to speak the language, because little kids will just, float between languages as they're comfortable. But my grandmother sometimes refers to Roma who grew up more deeply in traditional culture as Roma, and refers to herself as someone with Romani heritage. She usually uses the word gypsy because, especially among older Roma and Roma from Europe, sometimes they just use that word because it's a word that everyone has used to describe them. It's a word that they're more comfortable with. They feel like it makes more sense to them, or they don't have strong feelings about it. Whereas, especially some of the younger Roma and related groups, because sometimes the word Roma refers to a lot of different Vitsas, which are Romani groups that may not themselves identify as Roma. Like Sinti often see themselves as separate, but there are many other Vitsas that feel a little different because of their migratory roots or their cultural changes or their dialects or a number of things. So I'm using Roma really broadly to describe all of the subgroups that are kind of just for convenience umbrellaed underneath the term. But my grandmother raised me with as much as she could, which was a lot of the family trades. Most Roma don't tell fortunes, and it tends to be a practice that you really only do if you're broke. And whereas our divination for each other is different, it's usually campfire-based, dream-based, healing. And what we do for outsiders is like the palms, the cards, and tea leaves. Sometimes we use tea leaves for each other too, but my grandmother remembered what her grandmother did to get by before the war. She was kind of a famous dancer at the time. I have a really beautiful photo of her where she's in her dance attire, and she has this beautiful like leather waist cincher and this gorgeous apron, which is part of a traditional dress for Roma. And she has her cute little dancing shoes, and she just looks so sassy and gorgeous. And she was also a fortune teller. And my grandmother loves to tell stories about how her grandparents met. It was really quite sweet because before the war, there was a Sinti middle class, which, doesn't really exist anymore, or a Romani middle class. And my great-grandfather, my grandmother's grandfather, was pretty well-to-do. He did a lot of business with non-Roma, and he had a little farm, and he really he fell madly in love with Matilda Von Thiele, my great-great-grandmother. And he was like, I could give you a good life. And she's like, don't get me wrong, I really like you, but you seem a little above my station. I don't know if you'd be happy with me. I'm a fortune teller, I'm a dancer. You're not from performing family. And so to prove to her how much he loved her, he asked her to teach him all her trades, how to read cards, how to read palms and tea leaves. He wanted to know how to dance. And then he performed them alongside her to show her how much he respected the family that she came from. Because fortune telling is often seen as, not super classy among Roma. And so I grew up with that really beautiful love story. They lived very happily. They also survived the war. They lived deep, deep, deep in the tiny German mountains. And I see the kind of work I do every day, the kinds of things my grandmother raised me with, and the story she had, and her belief about everything having a spirit, Roma are animistic, as my connection to my ancestors. And she taught me, she wouldn't call it meditation, but meditation from when I was a really young age, so I could clear my mind and connect with my ancestors and with spirit and with animals and plants. She taught me dream interpretation, and it just feels very folded into my everyday life.
That's beautiful. I mean, there's a story here of, I get that there's impact on the lineage, of course, through the war, but there's also something that's unbroken, right? That you're the descendant of this lineage. women on both sides, where there's a lot of connection to things that give meaning, and especially on the side of your Sinti grandma, of like where the just that those things being passed down. And I think about, how are the ways that so many that folks connect with their ancestors, and it's things like recipes or sayings or songs or practices, right? This is the way that we know that even if we didn't know somebody, like those, you didn't know your great great grandma, right? Like that you're telling her stories and you're doing the practices that she did, and there's something so like belongy about it, right? Of like coming from a lineage.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I feel so lucky to know those stories. And on my Italian side, I think I definitely connect with my ancestors through gardening and through recipes and little stories. And, my Nona, just coincidentally, back when she was living in a little Massachusetts mill town in Groveland, and she was really young. Roma used to come up and down the coast selling wares and performing. That doesn't really happen anymore at all, but back then it did. And her mother would always say, "Okay, watch out for the gypsies. They're coming to town." And immediately she would get dressed up and run out and go hang out with the Roma that she had made friends with over the years. And she loved, talking to them about sewing, about fashion. She really wanted to be a fashion designer. And so when my father brought home a Romani girl, she was so excited. And so I've been really lucky to have that acceptance on both sides, and to be able to connect with my Nona, especially through food and stories, and, the kinds of earthy things that her family did. My ancestors on her side were like the workers who kind of came with a farm back when Italy was a little different. And so, her grandmother knew how to do absolutely everything, and her mother knew how to do everything, make all her clothes, and make anything from scratch and grow anything. And so I've been trying to live up to that too, trying to get better at being self-sufficient.
I noticed that there's a lot of threads of making that you're holding, and performance, and art and writing, and just like creativity. And I'm curious about that, and especially about the art modeling. And first, just wondering if you'd talk a little bit about that, and then, just wondering how that fits in with heritage.
The art modeling is kind of a funny little strand that I didn't really understand how it connected to my heritage until I learned more about the history of art modeling later. But originally I had started in college because I really, really needed money. And so I was 18 years old, and I was attending an all-women's university, so it felt like a really safe place for me to explore being naked and still for long periods of time. And as I learned more about the history of art modeling, I learned that Roma, who came to especially England, but other parts of Europe, Roma were really showing up in Europe around the 1300s. But by the time the 1600s rolled around, artists were not really painting so much in guilds anymore. They were more interested in creating their own individual reputation as an artist, and depicting things that weren't just religious, and particularly more in like the 1600s and a little later. But I learned that a lot of art models were Romani women, and that was, as I imagine, I don't know a lot about this because very little records exist, but I imagine that was very contentious at the time, probably for the women and their families. But it was so hard to be Romani. It still is in Europe. In the Balkans, Roma were enslaved for 400 years and were emancipated just about 10 years before slavery ended in the U.S. And, in other parts of Europe, there were all types of really scary persecutory laws, like in the early modern period in England, you were not just allowed but encouraged, if you found a Romani person, to nail them to the tree by their ears. Really like messed up legacies of violence there, just folded into the law, and you could legally rape or kill a Romani person. And so, these women around this time were probably just doing anything they could to survive. And art modeling became a source of income. And you can see too in some paintings like Caravaggio and others have lots of paintings of Romani women, usually in really stereotypical lights. Like there's one that Caravaggio has of a Romani woman reading a young fop's palm, and she's like bursting out of her corset, and he doesn't see that she's stealing from him as she's reading his palm. And then there's a painting that he did called The Card Players, where, there's lots of buxom Romani ladies just stealing from everyone as they're playing cards. And so, these depictions were really unfortunate and didn't help the rampant human rights abuses at the time. All these portrayals were just sort of reinforcing all these ideas of Roma being degenerate and hypersexualizing Roma, where it's like sex slavery and trafficking was a really big problem then, and forced prostitution. So becoming an art model, where sometimes I'll play a little bit with my heritage by keeping my hair in braids or wearing certain types of jewelry, I feel like I get to take control over my depiction. I get to pose the way I want to pose. I often pose in really powerful stances. I am lucky that my father is a really good martial artist, and he has been teaching me the basics of knife fighting. And so I have the practice knives that we work with, and I often pose with those. And I try to do things that take power back into the image of a nude form. And in that way, I feel like I'm honoring the Romani women before me who silently worked this trade. It's really not something that's acknowledged a lot in art history or academia. And I'm taking some power back.
It's interesting. I had the opportunity to live in Eastern Europe right after the fall of communism. I lived in Bulgaria for a couple of years, and there was a very present Roma population.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had Roma students and had Roma friends, and but the segregation, right? Like there were separate areas of town. Like it was very, very, very segregated, and very it wasn't Jim Crow, but it was, right? It was the same situation of just like when you say flagrant human rights abuses, like I was like, oh yeah, that's like, I don't know that I had those words at that particular time in my life. But it was really intense and painful to be around, and just kind of the things that you're talking about. Like I saw those things, I saw them in real time. I mean, I didn't see anybody with their ear nailed to a tree, but I saw other things that just like, and there's just this sense of helplessness, right? When you're dealing with institutionalized racism that's like that, it's protected in every way. By the community and by the police and by all of the, people in positions of authority. And just really intense. And I just remember feeling like this real sense of like powerlessness. And it was interesting because what you're talking about in the modeling of like taking back the power of that, taking back the power of your heritage, and the especially this lineage of modeling for money, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of using it in a way that that feels empowering to you. I just think about like, what are the things that heal ancestry, right? Of like, how do we support our ancestors in greater degrees of wellness in the lineage, right? When they had to endure like really terrible things. And, I just imagine that your ancestors are like super excited to see you with those knives in your hands, and Yes, it's beautiful. Thank you for
Thank
that.
you. Yeah, if anyone's interested in learning more about the early modern period in Roma and art modeling and other aspects of Romani life, there is this amazing scholar, and who's also I'm lucky to have as a friend, Sydney Wagner. It's Sydnee and then Wagner. And she writes really fascinating things about Shakespeare and race, early modern period in Roma. She's a gift. And also, there are some performers and artists. Selma Selman is this incredible Romani artist, and she also she grew up in Bosnia, and she has this great program for education in her village called Get the Heck to School, because there's still so much segregation, like you were saying, apartheid. Romani kids are often explicitly not allowed to go to schools that non-Roma go to in Eastern Europe, or it's just because they're bullied so much by teachers or automatically put into special education classes whether or not they need them. And she's amazing, and she's also a really gifted painter and performance artist who deals a lot with depiction of Roma and human rights. And Michaela Dragon is a really gifted performer from Romania, and she has a Romani feminist theater troupe called, actually, I am not 100% that I'm pronouncing it correctly, Guivlipen. It's Givlipen, which is the Romani word for feminism, which she kind of coined. And she also coined Roma futurism. And she is a real gift and does so much about the legacy of all kinds of human rights abuses among Roma and also the successes of Roma. For instance, there's still a problem with forced sterilization among Roma in Europe. And the same thing happened in the US against Roma, especially against Indigenous women and Black women as well as other women of color. And it's really nice to be able to connect with the work of these artists and academics.
Do you experience tokenism?
Oh, yeah. It's hard because the kinds of work that my family does are, it's kind of like Chimamanda Adichie says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, it's that they're incomplete. And so in some ways I look very stereotypical with the dancing, the fortune telling, even the modeling, I think, can look that way. And so I have to be very careful about the kinds of jobs that I take and make sure that everyone understands what these trades mean and like what kind of gypsy I am, because I'm very easily tokenized. And some academic organizations that I've worked with before, I have even been told outright that, oh, we really wanted a gypsy managing editor for this, or, and it's just like, well, they say Roma, but yeah, I was like, oh, great. I feel like I belong here. And so I've definitely had those problems, and I've had to walk away from some things.
Wondering about, you spoke a little bit about the Sinti feeling distinct within the greater umbrella of Romani peoples, and I'm just wondering if there's anything you want to share about that.
Yeah, I wish I understood more about that distinction because I didn't know any other Sinti people until I became an adult. So I guess that's another really bizarre thing about being Romani in the US is that sometimes you can grow up with the only other people Roma being your direct family. And I didn't meet another Romani person until I was 18, and I was way more excited to meet him than he was to meet me. And so it took a while for me to meet other Roma and really develop friendships and start to understand my culture just outside my family. And the advent of the internet being more present in my life, as I grew up, born in the 80s. So I didn't grow up with the internet alongside me for my whole childhood. So that helps a lot. But yeah, I know, Sinti, we have our own kind of language. There are certain things that we believe and that we do that are very different than what other Roma do. The one that pops to mind was I was at a conference, and I was listening to a really gifted speaker talk about the presence of crows and in Romani music, and how crows were this symbol of like badness, and crow is a slur against Roma in Romania and some other places. And I was like, I raised my hand and I was like, that's so interesting, because I grew up with crows being a really positive thing, and the whole room of Roma just turned and looked at me like I was completely crazy. And then I said, but I'm Sinti. And everyone was like, oh, okay, yeah. And so one thing, the speaker was my friend, Ionita Costache. It's IOANIDACOSTACHE. And she's both a gifted musician and academic. And so, the men in my family, this was something only men did and died out because we lost most of the men in the family during the war. They were crow charmers and performed with crows. The whole idea was that you befriend the crows by giving them little gifts. And then when they start bringing you gifts, then you and that crow are pretty tight. And you can start, because they're so smart and they love learning things, you can start teaching them little tricks, and you can maybe even teach them to vocalize things that sound kind of like, human language. And then they will travel around with you because you're friends, and you'll perform in the street with them. And that's something that maybe I'm wrong, but I think only Sinti would do, whereas other Roma would be like, yeah, I'm not going anywhere near those crows. And while crows seems like a small thing for me to fixate on, the weight of the animal is so different in different visas from what I've learned from being friends with other Roma. That's definitely, it doesn't just come down to crows. I'm just picking something that I find delightful to talk about. But there are other distinct differences among, beliefs and food and, practices, especially language is different. Trying to relearn Sinti has been extremely challenging for me, because after the war, it became taboo to write down the language, and the Romani language tends to be more oral anyway. And there's a lot of contention about coming up with like a definitive encyclopedia of Romani language, because the dialects can be very different. Even though you can kind of understand if someone from any dialect speaks Romanesque to you, you know that it's Romanesque, but you might not really be able to understand a lot of the more distinct parts of the conversation. And I think Roma, the different visas in general, can be quite different from each other in a lot of ways that feel really significant for people. And I think it can be really hard sometimes for everyone to be included under the same umbrella, because, I've met Damari people who just really, really do not feel like they should be under the Roma umbrella, but for purposes of representation and even sometimes like organizational help, they kind of have to be. But it's really complicated, especially when we don't have a country to unify us. We kind of have to force all these disparate cultures to be one thing, and that's really not how it is for anybody. Even one individual Roma will have a very different experience of the Romani culture depending on how assimilated they grew up, where their ancestors are from, any religious beliefs their family may have adopted, and it's, we're not homogenous in any way.
And so when you experience that tokenism of kind of being essentialized down to, oh, you're Roma, I'm imagining that there's a lot of, like you said, representation, right? Like that, how important representation is. And I'm just getting from this conversation, like the ways that you are personally practicing and committed to embodying your culture, to relearning the language, and to practices that are both personally meaningful and also culturally representative, right? But like, how do you deal with that? Because I'm just guessing that there's like a tension in the doing that and then not want, like I'm sure you've heard or at least I have heard kind of the critique from Black women about like when people say, oh, she's so articulate, right? Like, oh, isn't that special? She's so articulate. And I'm remembering when I lived in Bulgaria, there was a lot of music and dance, and like people would have weddings, and like who you would have come and play in your wedding band would be Roma. Like that was right. Like those were the people. And so there's a lot of performance. There was a lot of, but there was also still this level of stigma. And so I'm curious of how do you navigate all that? Cause it just seems really complex.
I'm still learning how to do it. I think it's been like the things I struggle with particularly are, trying to remind people who are not Roma that I also have an academic life, and I would often be, challenged at conferences, whether or not I was presenting about something Romani, but if I had Roma in my background, there was a sense that people didn't think I really belonged there. People would come up to me, and this happens to loads of other Roma academics too, after I give, a talk on the history of Roma and art and how Roma create art now as a way to express activism and take back stereotypes. They just come up to me and say, oh, read my poem. And I had to try really hard not to cuss them out. It was challenging. And I also run
You never had like the impulse to be like, oh, let me read your poem. Oh, look, you're a racist asshole.
Yeah, I've always wanted to, but I always just kind of go for like leaning in really close and say, no, I'm not doing that. And it's just,
that's awesome.
It's just really, hard to remain polite, and I don't always succeed. I think that's okay. We don't have to remain polite. We can be pissed. But I also run into the issue of, because I do a lot of things that are not traditional, particularly modeling nude, even though it's in a lot of different formats, and still a lot of Roma become very offended by that. Some Roma really support what I do with the art modeling, or I also talk openly about my history of sexual abuse, sexual assault, rape, and I've written about how to heal from those things using different types of sexual expression, and like leaning deep into pleasure as a way to allow yourself to heal from it if that's what feels right to you. And I've had a lot of Romani men, not a lot, but a fair number of Romani men react by trying to like use that as an excuse to come on to me in an inappropriate way, or in ways that feel degrading to me. And then when I am not receptive, they turn around and say, well, you're not a real Roma. A real Romani woman would never do this. That said, I've also had plenty of Romani men be like, congratulations for you, like really making it work, talking about things that are hard and important. And so I don't want to, pretend that it's all Romani men who react poorly. And then I've had some Romani women be very supportive, and others say, a real gypsy would never do this. You're getting what you deserve by having these guys harass you. And when I talk about it more a little bit with them, because I'm definitely more sympathetic to, Roma femmes and who respond that way, like, why do you feel that way? I would fight for you if this happened to you. And more often than not, they had a trauma in their past that was blamed culturally on them for being too provocative or whatever it was. And they are just trying to protect me by saying, don't do this. Like, you're ruining what it is to be Roma. You're putting yourself in danger. And so I get a lot of mixed responses about whether or not I should be openly Roma when I do things that are more, contentious, because like a lot of traditional cultures, Roma have a lot of restraint on women's sexuality, not just from dress code, but also the idea that the lower half of the body is impure, especially during menstruation. And my grandmother escaped Germany when she was 19, and she's like, all right, I'm going to wear pants. I'm going to do whatever I want. She wanted to express herself however she wanted. When she had neighbors spying on her because they were suspicious of her, I don't know if they knew she was Romani or not, she went and did a striptease on top of the hill where everyone could see her because she wanted to give them something real to talk about. And so I grew up with like a very, after I got divorced, my grandmother hugs me and said, get it while you're young. She's just very, very forward thinking and progressive and really sex positive. So I didn't grow up with all of the kinds of sexual cultural restraints. I did grow up with some of them. But, for the most part, that wasn't my experience. And that's kind of atypical. And my job, I feel like, has been to, when I do something that feels almost like I'm in a role to be representative or tokenized, to try to emphasize that I'm just one Romani mixed person, and that my experience is not reflective of everyone's, and try to explain all the different forces at play. But it's really hard. I worry that I mess up a lot. I'm sure I mess up a lot, but learning as I go.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for just being able to talk a little bit about what it is to hold that complexity. And it's actually, I've heard it from other guests also of kind of like, especially diasporic folks who are holding a tradition, especially when there's mixed race involved, right? And that you said about like realness. I mean, I hear it all the time in the trans community, like, am I trans enough? Right.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing, kind of in that same line of like, am I Roma enough? Is my blood pure enough or whatever, and it's just that, policing seems like a thing in every culture, like how we police others' identities. And like, it's like, basically they're saying like, if you're going to do that, you don't belong here. Like you're not this if you're that, right? And you're saying, no, I'm this and I'm that. I'm sexual and I'm a performer and I'm an academic and I'm in model and I'm Roma and, and I have all these like there's like a refusal to be essentialized that I hear you talking about, right?
Yeah, my trans and non-binary Romani friends have to do this work so much more than I do. And it's really frustrating that the presence of different types of religion have made it a lot harder for trans and non-binary Roma to exist, and queer Roma. And it's been really nice to see the activism around gender and sexuality, because I think, and I could be wrong, but I think before cultural colonization, I have a feeling that it wasn't so hard to exist between genders or have a kind of fluidity with gender. And that's something that the religion that Roma have adopted alongside Ramanapan has made harder. But, I could be wrong, especially since, from what I understand of Romani culture, family is really number one. And if you disagree with the person's lifestyle or don't understand it, I'm using lifestyle really loosely. The idea is that family matters more and you should love your family and community. My grandmother finding out that I was queer was just sort of like, oh yeah, that's nice. It wasn't a big deal. She was like, my sister is too. Did I ever tell you? I was like, oh no, okay. And of course there were cultural restrictions. I don't believe that my great aunt has ever like openly had a female partner. But I know that, when she was younger, she refused to wear skirts and she always preferred pants, which was kind of a big deal back then, and can be a big deal in some Romani communities now. And so that's, I really applaud all the Roma who are just like really openly living their truth and doing that like constant grinding work just to exist. And it's extraordinary.
You have a song from your grandmother, yeah?
Not so much from my grandmother. It's my Vitsa does not celebrate this holiday. It's more something that Eastern European Roma celebrate, but I just really love the song Edelezi. And this song is a spring celebration that a lot of different Vitsas in that part of the world celebrate. It's usually coincides with St. George's Day.
Uh-huh.
It's in early May.
Yeah, May 6th.
Yeah. And I love this song mostly because first I heard my friend Tatiana Eva Marie perform it. And I just really love her version, which is the version I selected. But there's so many really, really gorgeous versions of this song. So I encourage people to listen to the different takes on it. And the first time I heard the song, you know, not being fluent in the language, it just sounded so haunting and so gorgeous and dark. And I was like, wow, what are the lyrics of the song? And then I looked it up, and it's sung from the perspective of a child who's pouting while everyone is dancing and eating lamb and throwing flowers and doing all the things that people do on this gorgeous spring celebration holiday. And it's like, everyone's doing this stuff without me. Mom and dad are dancing. I'm not dancing. And it's just kind of the oddest little folk song. Like, once I read the lyrics, it's like, what is this magical thing? And so I feel like it's a song full of delights and surprises. Its tone doesn't really match the lyrics for me personally, not having grown up with it. And it really is just absolutely gorgeous and stunning. And it's also playful and light. And Tatiana does such a gorgeous job with the song.
Let's give a listen. Great. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that song with us.
She's such a gift.
She is. I want to finish by asking you a little bit about magic. I want to clarify that I'm asking this because I asked you what you wanted to be asked about, and you said you wanted to be asked about magic.
I do.
Not because I'm like, oh, it's read my palm, right?
I can tell you're not like that.
Okay. Yeah, just if you would talk a little bit about your own relationship with magic and how do you hold it in the context of that stereotype and what's important here?
Well, I, like most American teenage girls, was really interested in Wicca when I was young. I don't identify as Wiccan. It was more of a phase that I went through. But I did get really interested in studying, once I kind of grew out of that a little bit, studying different pagan traditions. I also have some Irish ancestry and, a little bit of a mix. And when I went to college, I found this really amazing Fox Rose Temple out in Roanoke. They might have relocated since because that was a very long time ago. But I studied more formally with a pagan priestess and with a whole coven that became a temple. And I was really in love with what they did. Again, it's not something that I adhered to. I didn't stay in the temple. I'm more of someone who really enjoys learning about different approaches to spirituality. But I am very curious. I know what I grew up with from my grandmother, which Roma would not describe as magic. She would never describe it as magic. But to me, it feels very magical. Roma clean a lot because purity, both physical and spiritual, is really important. And that feels magical to me because as you're sweeping your home, it's not just that you're sweeping, but you're consciously sweeping out anything that no longer needs to be there. And purification rituals like bathing and things like that feel very imbued with magic to me. And whereas most Roma wouldn't describe them that way. And so, but because I do love looking at the magic and the mundane, and because I do love ritual and I love learning about, the different magic in my ancestry, there's a really hard line of Strega Nona in my background, especially in my Aunt Susan, is just witchy as hell. And, so I like to do all those things with her. And so I try to make really clear what is part of my Romani heritage and what is other stuff that I've picked up along the way that connects with my heritage, or if it doesn't, that I just like to discuss and direct people to the experts in the field. And I feel like I live a very magical life especially dealing with CPTSD, which can be really disruptive, and trying to stay really high functioning. I find that magical ritual is one of the things that grounds me and kind of helps me navigate these nonlinear, very complicated places that CPTSD takes me to. And it helps me stay healthy, to have rituals to navigate my shadow self or move past energies that cling to me, or to lean into self-love and self-care. Self-care is such a strange word, but lean into self-love. And so I feel like I'm constantly just defining and clarifying because magic is a really big part of me and part of what I do. I like to do spells for people if they want to. I'm kind of like a witch for hire. And I always used to do that kind of work. Like when I was 10, my first job, my first real job was modeling Victorian doll clothing when I was 4, but that was a really strange little childhood foray. But my first real job was when I was 10, and I used to do horse healing, and I would not think about it too hard, and I would just go up to the horse and place my hands on them because I grew up around horses. my grandmother took up horse trading when she got to the US. And I would just kind of intuit what was wrong with them. And because I was 10, I had no filter. I would just be like, oh, this horse actually doesn't like being next to the other horse, and it hates the radio being in its stall. It's too loud for them. And for some reason, people would hire a 10-year-old to say stuff like this and make the changes I suggested, and miraculously, they kind of helped. And so to deny that like mystical part of myself feels like a denial of self. And at the same time, I feel like I'm constantly making it abundantly clear that Roma are not magical creatures. And it's hard to be both things, but I'm trying.
I'm just letting that land. It's hard to be both things. Mm-hmm. Right. I'm just imagining that folks who are listening can resonate with that no matter, kind of what, because we're all, I imagine, walking in the stereotype shadow of some sort, right?
Yeah.
Of the projections of how we're read, and what people immediately put on us when they see us, and how do we hold, just that complexity if it's something that actually has deep meaning. I struggle with this too, of being a magical person and also really hating the stereotype of, woo white new age people, right? And like, how do I differentiate from that in a way that's not like shaming of other people, right?
Yeah, because I mean, I haven't been treated well. I think a lot of people of color and different heritages haven't been treated well in the like woo white new age communities.
Of course,
and so that's also something I want to separate myself from, not just because I don't identify with it, but because it feels kind of poisonous to me. I know it can be really good for some people, but that hasn't been my own experience. And the kind of ancestral work I do is so different than that. Having an ancestor altar in my house and working constantly with my well ancestors is something that feels very uniquely Roma. And so when I go into those spaces to work, at like different festivals and things like that, I feel very out of place.
Yeah. I remember reading a few years ago about folks with disabilities who were hiring themselves out to families to go to Disneyland, so that the family, if they had this disabled person with them, could go through the line.
Oh.
And I remember really thinking, well, that's kind of brilliant in one way, right? Like way to work it, way to like, be like, and like, okay, capitalism, you're going to do it like this. Well, I'm going to do it like this, and I often, I think about that sometimes of like, just the ways that if these things are put on us without our consent, shall we not benefit from them? Right.
Yeah.
And like, we get to decide what that means to us, like that, like where it becomes too much cost to us, to our souls, and where it's, in that land of benefit. I think about this every time I have to go to the bathroom and I'm in public and I'm like, all right, which bathroom has the shorter line? Which bathroom is cleaner? Where am I going to experience less harassment? Right. It's like that. Yeah. And so I'm just imagining like it's similar in some ways to putting on that role.
Yeah. I feel like I'm walking that line a lot because I don't make a lot as an educator, which should shock nobody. And so I do rely on these family traits to make a living. And I feel like I'm constantly walking that line, and sometimes compromising a little bit how I feel about my depiction because the girl's got to eat.
Yeah. And it's a complicated, I mean, at least on my end of it, it's a complicated compromise, right? And because sometimes I can get all, I don't know about you, but I can get all like, well, fuck you. I'm just gonna do this thing, and it's gonna bring benefit to me and my family, and that's fine. And then sometimes I'm like, oh, I'm letting trans people down, or like whatever the thing is, right? So I hear that. Jezmina, I want to invite you you have a super cool project coming up, and I just want to invite you to speak a little bit about it.
Oh, yeah. So I'm launching this website, Goldorned, I'm not exactly sure about the launch date yet, but I chose a word that I made up because gold is such an important commodity for a lot of different cultures, and such an important element to work with. Goldsmithing is a really popular Romani trade, and it's huge among a lot of different cultures. And I wanted to create a site where I could interview people of a lot of different identities and backgrounds about their craft. And sometimes that craft is academia, and sometimes it is adornment and the things that we wear or decorate ourselves with. Sometimes it's the arts. And I've been really frustrated in academia, particularly when I'm not teaching in a higher education space. But even then, I find that the curriculum I want to create, which usually centers on, trans, non-binary, or like women identifying people of color who have, some sort of activist background, it's often discouraged or even outright not allowed for me to talk about or cover. And so I wanted to create a place for people to share their knowledge and share their wisdom, and have it be partially interview based and partially, articles about all these different topics for how we adorn ourselves and adorn our lives, literally and figuratively. And so I really would like to create a safe space for contributors, and to spotlight people who are doing really important things now in the arts and sciences and academics, and also in the past. And so I'm really excited to get this project going and together. Right now I'm working on finishing a book, and so I have to kind of prioritize the book a little bit first, but then I'm rolling out the magazine, and I can't wait.
And if people want to follow you, get in touch with you, where should they go?
Right now, I think my Instagram is really active. It's Jezmina.Von Thiele is my handle, but I also have JezminaVonThiele.com, and my academic or like writing name, JessicaReidy.com. Reidy is Reidy. And so those are places to contact me for booking or for any kind of project. I like to offer my services as an editor and writer. And I also book readings over the phone and in person. And so, I'm available. You can book all the readings under Jezmina Von Thiele. And my Instagram is a good place to stay in touch with me too.
Okay. I'm just going to spell it again. It's JezminaVonThiele. So check out Jezmina there. And Jezmina, I just want to really thank you so much for coming on Bespoken Bones, talking about all these amazing things. It's been enlightening, and really just glad to hear about your work in the world.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. It really means a lot to be included. I love this podcast. Thank you.
I'm so glad. I'm glad it's helpful. And folks, if it's helpful to you, if you like these conversations and you want to support them to continue, you can check out our Patreon. It gives you access to our upcoming guests. You can ask your dream questions. You can suggest guests. We also have a new YouTube channel that you can like and subscribe to. So do all that stuff, which helps us make more awesome content like this. And I'm Pavini Moray. This is Bespoken Bones, and we'll be back every full and new moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.